Hey viewers, my name's Cara. Over on my Patreon, in my Patreon community, some of us have been reading The Spiral Dance together. And you may have heard me mention this before if you have been watching my channel, or you may be finding this video, or what will become a series of videos, because you are looking for information on The Spiral Dance. So what I want to do in these videos is go through some of my notes and some of the discussion questions and some prompts that I have come up with as I've been rereading this book, and that those of us reading and discussing it together have come up with, and some of the things that we have been talking about the most. So if you are looking for a thorough sort of review of this book, that's not what this video or this series is going to be. And also, feel free to listen to these videos and think about these prompts for yourself, even if you haven't read the book. However, I do want to say that these videos will probably be more helpful for people who have either already read this book or who are deciding to read it now. Because my videos tend to be pretty long, as it is, I'm probably not going to spend a lot of time going into the full context of anything that I'm about to mention, in which case it will make more sense to you if you are reading through these chapters yourself and then looking at the discussion questions, prompts, things like that I'm going to be sharing with you that we have been discussing in our group. Or if you have already read the book previously, maybe it will remind you of some of the things. But if you have not ever looked at this book before, some of these things might seem really out of context. And again, you're free to just use them as sort of food for thought or journaling prompts for yourself, just based on the topics in general. However, it might make a big difference if you actually read the book and have the context of how it is being discussed in the book. So with that said, at this point in time, I and the group that are reading together, we are finishing up chapters 5 and 6 this month. I am recording this in August of 2020. We started in May. We've been doing 1 or 2 chapters per month. So this is my copy. So I decided, since I was going to be sort of facilitating a discussion group and then doing these videos to kind of go over it for those people who aren't in the group but might want to hear what we've been talking about, I decided to count the page numbers, and I've actually written it in for myself in the table of contents, so I know about how many pages long each chapter is and then how many pages of notes there are. This is the 20th anniversary edition of the book. There is also a 10th anniversary edition, and then of course the original edition. So the difference between those is that for the 10th and 20th anniversaries, the author, Starhawk, actually has included notes on the original text that show up in the back of the book, as well as 2 additional introductions to the book from the 10th and 20th anniversaries. So this book was written, it was published in 1979, but it was written throughout sort of the late 70s when the author was in their mid-20s. So the 10th anniversary includes an introduction and notes of the author in her 30s, looking back at the original text and making some updates and telling us what had already changed in what became the reclaiming tradition. It was not considered a tradition in itself when the original text came out, so that's one major change. But talking about a lot of the things that had changed, views that had already started to change, shifts that already had started to be made in the community by 10 years later. And then the 20th anniversary edition, same thing. The author, now in their 40s, giving more thoughts and more background information on how things had changed, evolved, grown in the next 10 years. So if you can get a hold of a copy of the 20th anniversary edition, I highly recommend it. However, there are some people who have been reading along with us who have the 10th anniversary edition, and that's good too. I just like the fact that it even exists. And of course now, the 20th anniversary edition was in 1999, so we would have had 30th anniversary in 2009 and a 40th anniversary in 2019. However, there are no further editions of this book. But if we had them, there's another 20 years have passed since then. So I like to point it out just because with any book, and even with YouTube videos, YouTube videos that have been made years and years ago, the author's views have changed, the views of the community overall and the tradition that has come out of it have changed. There are some things, of course, that are kind of core factors that hold true even today, that are pretty similar to how they were in the original text of this book, but there are also a lot of updates that have been made. So when we look at the things that had already changed by the 10th and 20th anniversaries, just imagine 20 more years since then is where we are now. When we look at this, we've been looking at this in terms of, I've been saying, like a time capsule. Anytime we read a book that was published decades ago, we're really looking at a time capsule of what that author felt and thought about that topic at that time. It doesn't necessarily tell us what's going on now. And there are more books about reclaiming tradition that have come out in the years since that give us more updated views. But here we are looking at a book that originally came out in 1979. I did not write down a lot of notes for myself for discussion about the introductions because it really is just sort of going over lots of things that have changed over time. So for anyone reading through this book now, or who has read this book previously, if you've read the further editions, the other introductions, I would say, my questions about that I ask myself are typically things like, how do I react to hearing or reading that these certain particular things have changed? Is that a change that I expected? Is that something that I assumed had not changed by this time, and then reading about it makes me think about things differently? So that would be my kind of general thought prompts for reading through the introductions, is just noting maybe what surprised you, what you expected, what you didn't expect. And then what I wrote down for my personal notes for the introductions were just some of my favorite quotes, so I'm not going to go through all of that. But in the introduction to the 10th anniversary edition, the first thing that I wrote down is that Starhawk mentions the 3 core principles of what is known as goddess religion. That is the term that she uses, so I put it in quotes. The 3 core principles are immanence, interconnection, and community. And so a little discussion or personal journaling prompts or just food for thought that could come out of that is, what do you already know about those 3 words? What do those 3 terms mean to you? And then again, if you're actually reading the book and looking at the context of how Starhawk explains those words, how do you react to those things as being core principles of a religious or spiritual path? How do you feel about those things? Do you feel that they apply to your path or not? Immanence, interconnection, and community. And so again, I'm not going to go into the full context. It'll make more sense, be more useful if you're actually reading through the book. In chapter 1, which is entitled Witchcraft as Goddess Religion, of course, she's talking a lot about what that meant at the time. What is goddess religion? The first part of the chapter mainly constitutes a mythic history. It's telling a story, sharing things that are oral tradition, stories of what we imagine might have been true, even though there might not be any factual evidence for them. And in the introductions and in the further notes, Starhawk talks about how in the original text, she was referencing things and talking about ideas from things that in later years were revealed to not be historically, factually accurate. And she talks about how maybe that doesn't always matter, that it matters, we care about what is historically true, we're interested in history, but it doesn't matter in the sense of if something works for us and if something resonates for us, it doesn't matter how old it is. So that's another discussion topic that we definitely brought up and that is a good one to think about. How important is it to you that things in your path are old, that they have long established lines of tradition of being practiced by other people? Because there is a certain power that comes from that, doing something that you know has been done generation after generation. But then also, what is the place of establishing our own practices that as we continue to do them later become known as tradition? Does it matter that something that we're doing now is 50 years old or 500 years old or 5 months old? And if we know that something we imagine, something that we consider part of our mythic history, part of our shared mythos, if we know that it is only a story and that it doesn't have any basis in history or fact, does that change things for us? If we know that it's just a story meant to inspire us, meant to illuminate an idea of how something in the world works, what does it change for us compared to if we believed it was historically or factually accurate? What do human beings get out of storytelling? As a theater person, I definitely consider myself someone who benefits from story, and I feel like stories can have truths even if they are not directly telling us fact. The chapter also talks a bit about the witch trials and the Inquisition. So some of the things that I always think about when it comes to that subject matter is about how a lot of people say that they feel they connect and relate to the victims of witch trials and of the Inquisition. So discussion questions based on this for me are things like, do we feel a connection to those who were accused and executed? What kind of connection do you feel toward those people, if any? And does it matter if they were or weren't real witches, the way that we think of witches today? Does it matter if they knew or thought of themselves as practicing witchcraft? Or maybe they were Christians who knew something about herbalism, and that was enough to be associated with witchcraft. Do those things matter to you, and why or why not? Just things to think about, just things to journal about. One thing I will say about this book also is that it tends to jump from one subject to another rather quickly, so especially in this first chapter, it just briefly touches on a lot of other concepts. It briefly starts to touch on feminism, ecology and care for nature, justice, love, sexuality and consent, magic. All of these things are just sort of briefly touched on in chapter 1, and then they are expanded on later in the book, or especially in later books by Starhawk. She expands on a lot of these ideas in other books. And then the chapter wraps up with a quick basic description of a ritual. So knowing that the rest of the chapter has a bunch more stuff throughout it, here are some of the discussion questions that I came up with for us and for myself from the rest of this first chapter. What do you think about goddess tradition as specifically having a feminist political identity? Are you comfortable on an individual level with politics in your religion or spirituality? And I say on an individual level because I don't mean on an institutional or governmental level. So I'm not asking how do you feel about a government or an institution telling you what you have to believe in your religion or spirituality. That gets into separation of church and state type topics, which is a separate discussion. But for this, I'm posing the question, for us as individuals, our individual spiritual or religious path, how comfortable are you combining your personal political leanings with your spiritual path? Does that work for you? Does it not? Are they things that go together? Are they things that seem completely separate? Why? Why not? How do you feel and think about those things now, today? And also thinking about how political are other religions. Are there political views that tend to come out of religious and spiritual identity for other religions, maybe that you don't consider your own? And how does that thought process, thinking about how it works in other traditions, how does that affect then how you see your own? Starhawk also briefly mentions in this chapter having to address that there was an issue with people connecting pagans to Nazis at the time, and that was something that she felt the need to address in the original text. And now, 40 years later, we know that there are some white supremacist groups who also consider themselves pagan, and so that's something that we talked about a little more recently. So going back and reading this, I had read this book before years ago, but rereading it now, I was surprised to see that note in there again about the Nazi issue. So the question that I wrote down is, did we imagine that this was a decades-old issue too? And did we suspect that even 40 years later down the line, this would still be something that we're talking about? That because of some groups affiliating with certain beliefs and white supremacist beliefs, did we expect that that was going to be something that, that Starhawk would have felt the need to address in a book like this? And how often is that something that we still need to address today? So those are just briefly some of my thoughts on chapter 1 and some of the things we discussed. Chapter 2 is the first chapter in this book that starts to have exercises, things to actually do and practice as you're reading through it. So the first discussion question I wrote down is, what are your experiences while doing the exercises? So as you go through them, as you do them, maybe journal about your experiences or just think about how they make you feel, what they make you think. Are they similar to things you've already been doing? Are any of them completely brand new to you? In chapter 2, Starhawk talks a little bit about waking consciousness versus ritual consciousness, or what she calls starlight vision. She talks briefly about theories that at the time made a lot more sense as they were explaining these concepts to people. So she talked briefly about left brain, right brain theory. And then in the notes, she talks about how that's not really something that she thinks is as useful anymore. And so my discussion question based on this was, when people attempt to use psychological or scientific theories and ideas to explain things within the realm of modern paganism, witchcraft, and magic, do you find that helpful? Or do you find that it is more confusing? Are there times when making a comparison to scientific or psychological concepts that people might understand can be helpful? And are there other times where it can be unhelpful or even harmful to make those comparisons? I will say that when we had this discussion in the group, some people pointed out the fact that one of the times where it becomes unhelpful is if it's based on an unclear or an incomplete or incorrect interpretation of the theory that is trying to be used to explain these other things. Because if we're misunderstanding the thing in the first place, then it can be very unhelpful to use it as a comparison, because then we're basing it off of something that we don't really understand in the first place, and that perpetuates a misunderstanding about those theories within paganism and witchcraft. So I definitely think we've seen that before. And Starhawk mentions in the notes to the book that the original text had included talking about things like Freud's idea of the id, ego, and superego, and comparing that to the concept of the three selves, which starts to be introduced here, which is from fairy tradition, F-E-R-I, Victor and Cora Anderson's fairy tradition. And the notes mention that she decided to take that out because she later realized that they are not really comparable systems, and trying to compare them directly was more confusing and unhelpful than anything. So that actually is not part of the text anymore. So that's one example of where things don't exactly match up, and so trying to compare them could actually be more unhelpful, not useful, and how changes were made based on that. Speaking of the three selves, another discussion question I wrote down is thoughts on this introduction to the concept of the three selves, which come from fairy. And in this book, even in the 20th anniversary edition, the name of that tradition is spelled F-A-E-R-Y, which is how it used to be identified. But at some point, the tradition that was taught by Victor and Cora Anderson became known by a different spelling, F-E-R-I, to help further differentiate it from other fairy traditions that used those other spellings. So it had diverged enough, it was different enough in certain ways that there came a need for a different spelling to help make it even more clear. So that's another update since this book came out, that if you've read about F-E-R-I, fairy tradition, that is the tradition that Starhawk is talking about in this book, but it still uses the older spelling. So thoughts on the introduction to the three selves that is in chapter 2, and the role of things like poetry, music, and ritual as ways of contacting younger self. Another big thing we talked about is the fact that reclaiming community rituals and events are alcohol and substance-free spaces. And in the intros to the book, or in the notes, Starhawk talks about how a lot of people are in recovery, and so they decided to make a change where it's not that people who consider themselves part of the community can't drink or partake in other things as they will on their own time, but they decided that for community events, for example, alcohol is no longer passed around in the ritual chalice that everyone is expected to drink from, because it was recognized that that can be harmful for people who are in recovery. So they decided that for like official events, classes, workshops, and this is true of every camp, class, and workshop that I have attended within Reclaiming Tradition as well, no alcohol or substances. And we also just think about, it's about thinking of the needs of the community and who's going to be there. If someone RSVPs for a workshop and says they have a severe peanut allergy, then everyone is informed that if we're bringing our own snacks, please do not include peanuts or peanut butter in our snacks, because we don't know what we're going to be doing in the workshop, if we're going to be holding hands with someone who's severely allergic and they will still be affected by that later. Or it might be something like people who are sensitive to scents. We decide that we are not going to wear our strongest and most pungent perfume or cologne or essential oil to that workshop, and we are not going to be burning incense because people might be sensitive to scents or to the smoke, or whatever the case may be. It's about thinking about who we are going to be in community with. It does not mean that on your own time you can't still utilize those things. It doesn't mean that I don't use incense when I'm at home. But if I'm going to a workshop where we are doing no scent, then I am not burning my incense, I am not wearing my most fragrant perfumes, etc. So we talked a lot about that, about how having an alcohol and substance-free community event, having rituals be done that way, how we feel about that, what we think about it, and how that might be different than things that we've experienced before or things that we've read or seen before. Chapter 2 also discusses the fairy creation myth, F-E-R-I, fairy, the creation myth from that tradition. And so as a discussion prompt, your thoughts on the creation myth. It also briefly in this chapter talks about shamanism and ecstasy, because Reclaiming considers itself an ecstatic tradition, and ecstasy is also a foundational core sort of point of what some people know as shamanism. So that was mentioned in the book. However, today, naming things like witchcraft as shamanism and speaking about them as though they are the same thing is considered problematic, because we now know that the term shaman, the word shaman, or shamanism, really came from and referred to a very specific cultural practice, which is not what the rest of us are doing. And it is my belief that it was used then to say, we are doing, or that we have practices that have some similarities to what we know about the culture of who we call the shamans. And what I think that really breaks down to is when Starhawk is talking about how ecstasy is considered a foundational point of shamanism, and witchcraft is also an ecstatic practice. So I think that is the connection, and the way that I deal with it now is, instead of claiming that witchcraft is shamanism, which is problematic and confusing, because again, it's a misunderstanding of the thing that we're trying to use as the comparison, which then leads to perpetuating that misunderstanding within our community. I think it's more useful to just say what we're talking about. If we're talking about ecstatic ritual, then we're talking about ecstatic ritual. And that can be something that we have in common with other practices and traditions without using terms that imply that we are the same as that, because we're not. So thoughts about that, thoughts about how witchcraft has been conflated with shamanism throughout history, and maybe do a little research about shamanism and where that term actually comes from and the culture that it comes from, the tradition and practices that have historically used that term, and how it sort of got disseminated into the modern paganism and witchcraft community and the New Age community for sure. And then thoughts more on ecstasy as an element of ritual. And no, I am not talking about the substance of the same name, but about the state of being, the emotion, the feeling, ecstatic ritual as its own topic. Because that's one of the things that also I feel like is considered a characteristic difference between reclaiming tradition and some other traditions, is the element of ecstatic ritual. This chapter also begins talking about the sexualization of concepts of polarity and duality and gender roles, and how they have been mapped onto this concept of balance and duality in spirituality. And one of the biggest things in the introduction to the 10th anniversary edition of this book, and throughout the notes of various chapters in the book in the 20th anniversary edition, which I have here, one of the biggest changes that Starhawk talks about is the way we talk about gender and the way we talk about sex, biological sex, and how we are changing the way that we think about those things, and therefore the way that we speak about those things, and how changing the way we speak about these things changes the way that we think about them too. So that concept starts to get talked about in chapter 2, and the other ways that we talk about energy instead. And I know that this is a subject that a lot of people are talking about. You don't have to be part of reclaiming tradition or have read any books by Starhawk to maybe have been part of a conversation about this before, about changing the language from talking about feminine and masculine energy and positive and negative energy to using different words to describe what we mean, so that they are not things that we hear and immediately it reminds us of those traditional binary gender roles. So thinking about that, polarity versus like full spectrum type of languaging. This chapter also briefly covers the Wheel of the Year, the cycle of the gods' birth, sacrifice, death, rebirth, things like that. So I also wrote down as a discussion point, and this is something that we talked about quite a bit in our group discussion as well, the concept of sacrifice and even the word sacrifice. Talking about journaling to yourself about how that word makes you feel. What are your associations with that word? And then how do we maybe have different understandings of what that word means when we use it in terms of our spiritual practice today? Do we use different words because of the connotation? Like, I personally might be more apt to say something like offering rather than sacrifice. And a discussion that we had within my Patreon community was actually, what is the difference in how we feel about those terms? Is offering versus sacrifice something that we make a distinction between? And I discovered that for me there is a little bit of a difference. And then chapter 3, which is the last chapter I wanted to talk about in this video, chapter 3 is titled The Coven. So the first thing that I put in our discussion group for us to talk about before anybody even started reading the chapter was to talk about different pagan and witchcraft groups and what we call them, and what are our impressions of different types of groups based on the words that they choose to use. Are these names interchangeable, or do they give us a different feel? So things like coven, circle, grove, community, study group, do those things evoke different ideas? And when we use them to describe different groupings of people coming together for different reasons, what sort of impression does that give us of those groups? Are certain words more associated with certain paths and traditions? I also asked everyone to talk about what were our first impressions about covens, that word, when we first started practicing or learning about any of this stuff. If you can think back to that time, if it's not right now, if it was a while ago for you, can you think back to what were your first impressions about covens, about a group of witches working together? And what assumptions do you have about covens now? And in the group, we shared some personal experiences of different types of groups that we've been a part of. I personally have never been part of something that I would call a coven. I do have a sort of a different thing in my mind with that word. It has a more specific meaning to me. I've also never been part of something I would call a grove, which I do associate more with druidic practice. I have been part of things that I would call circles or informal study groups and things like that. And I like to even specify informal some of the time, because I don't think I've really ever been part of a group that I would describe as formal in any way, or like having any kind of formal structure. So yeah, but this is something that everybody can answer, even if you've never picked up this book before. What are your impressions about covens? What does that mean to you? What does that word kind of make you think of? What were your impressions about it when you started, and what are your impressions now? How have things changed, if at all? This chapter also has a lot more exercises, many of which can be done solo, but some of which are specifically designed for group practice. And so we talked about which exercises are things that we've already been doing. There are a lot of exercises that people were sharing are similar to things that they've learned in contexts other than witchcraft and paganism. So there are things that those of us who maybe have gone to counseling or seen a therapist, they could be coping skills, relaxation techniques, or maybe some of them are, for me as a theater person, things that I learned in theater classes for relaxation, physical relaxation, concentration exercises. So we talked about maybe where we have learned similar exercises before, and now seeing them given as like witchcraft exercises, how does that make us feel differently about them, if at all? And then also looking at ones that are brand new and actually trying them out and talking about our experiences with trying these exercises. We also talked about the concept of working in groups versus working as a solitary in general, or a blend between the two, which I think is really the case a lot of the time, that if you are in a community, if you do work in a community, you also have things that you do on your own individually. So I will read you one quote that I wrote down here. In this edition of the book, it's on page 59. Other editions, I don't know what page, but it's in chapter 3. Witchcraft tends to attract people who, by nature, do not like to join groups. The coven structure makes it possible for rabid individualists to experience a deep sense of community without losing their independence of spirit. I love that quote. I wrote it down because that is something that comes up so often. A lot of people do not want to be part of a group because they feel like it means giving up the stuff that they do by themselves. And in my experience, that is not the case. And I know other people have talked about this as well, that even if you are part of a formalized group like a coven or similar, there are still things that you do on your own. You are still expected to have your own thing that you do. And so you're not fully giving up anything in order to be part of a community. If anything, I think we gain something. And I definitely have my own biases about that as well, coming from a background of someone who has never had a formal community. I've got my personal thing, I've got it. Nobody's taking that away from me. I can only gain by having a community. However, Starhawk does mention that not every community is the best. Not everybody who puts themselves out there as a leader is the best, or as a teacher is the best. Not everyone, when this was written, and even now, not everyone is really doing it for the benefit of community. Some people are doing it for the wrong reasons, whatever those may be. And so she does talk about the fact that even for those of us who want a community, we might not consider working by ourselves ideal because we want that community support. But working by ourselves is still better in many cases than working with the wrong group. It definitely has to be a good fit. It has to be a group that's going to feel supportive, that's going to feel challenging in good ways, that helps you grow. And that doesn't mean that you always agree with everyone in the group about everything, but it means that that group structure and experience is not going to be harmful to you. It is not going to be something that causes trauma. There are some bad situations that people have been in, and that needs to be acknowledged, that things like that happen, and that's not okay, and that is not what we are looking for. It's not what we are looking to create when we are seeking community. So some of the discussion questions I wrote down: joining groups or working alone? What interests you and why? Do you think you're the type of person who just always wants to work alone? Do you think you're someone who might like to seek out a community? If you're someone who already works in community, what is that like for you? How did you feel about that maybe when you were first getting involved? How do you feel about it today? How do you think other people feel about how you do things? What are some assumptions that we might know from being on the internet that other people have about community and about working in groups? Journal prompts galore with this. What do you think about such discussions of personal power and shared responsibility in leadership? That's something else that's talked about in this chapter. Starhawk talks about mentoring new people that are coming into the group and making sure that people who are learning have one-on-one support as well as group support and learning in the group context. She talks about how, this is another quote, it's from page 61 in my edition: "The goal of a coven is not to do away with leaders, but to train every witch to be a leader." And in the notes to the later editions of the book, she talks about how they did at some point, like within the first 10 years after the Spiral Dance originally came out, they did away with terms like high priest and high priestess, which are terms that they had originally learned from working with Wiccan traditions. They had been using those terms at first, but over time they evolved to be non-hierarchical in the sense that there are people who might facilitate ritual or a class. There might be people who are the leader of that ritual for that day, but they really rotate leadership. So there are notes about how that kind of evolved and changed over time as well, and there's a discussion of kind of how they thought about that shared power, shared responsibility in a community, so that it's not all on one or two people to make everything happen all the time, but really everybody shares in the responsibility of what's going on and everybody participates. So what do you think about these discussions of personal power and shared responsibility and shared leadership? This chapter also briefly talks about what witches do and don't charge money for, what they may or may not charge money for, and a balance between wanting to make things financially accessible for people who come from all different financial situations and have access to different amounts of resources, but also needing to balance that with making sure that people who are providing education or resources or opportunities and experiences, people who have worked to develop experiences and knowledge that they are then sharing with others, making sure that those people are justly and fairly compensated for their time and energy and experience and work. So a discussion or a journal prompt for yourself about charging money and the balance between financial accessibility and making sure that people are fairly compensated for their time and experience. You know, the concept of a sliding scale is not new, but I had only first heard about it through Reclaiming Community, which is absurd to some people that I've spoken to who are like, you've never heard of that before? But in my life, the concept of having a financially accessible, something like a sliding scale for people to be able to choose what they know they can afford, was a foreign concept to me until I started hearing about it through these books and through this community. It is not a foreign concept to everybody, and it is not a new concept, I know that. But if you, like me, were hearing about this for the first time through things related to something like Reclaiming Community, what are your thoughts about that? The first 5 exercises in Chapter 3 outline a basic ritual. Goes over casting a circle with group energy, a grounding meditation, raising energy, and earthing energy again. And then sharing food, drink, and gratitude. So if you're someone who's been practicing for a while, maybe something to look at in this would be, how similar is this to what you've already been doing? And, you know, for me it was quite similar. It's not going to be completely new information for a lot of people, because reclaiming was influenced by other traditions that the way that they were doing things, especially in the 70s when this first came out, will look quite familiar to some people depending on what your personal background and experience is in. There's also a brief discussion of group conflict and how to deal with that when it comes up in collaborative groups, And I put a note here that Starhawk has now written another book that is entirely about that. It was published in 2011. I read it last year. It's called The Empowerment Manual, a Guide for Collaborative Groups. And it's all about collaborative group process. It talks much more about conflict resolution and all sorts of things like that. Chapter 3 also talks about 4 basic abilities for beginners to develop. 2 of them I think are fairly self-explanatory as terms. They are relaxation and concentration. The other 2 need a little bit more explanation, which Starhawk provides in the book. The third one is visualization, which I have done videos about both here on my personal channel and over on the Pagan Perspective Collaborative channel. Visualization is defined as including all of our senses, any and all of our physical senses that an individual person has access to. So even though it's called visualization, which makes us think vision, eyesight, visualization as a skill and as a practice to work on and develop actually also includes the other senses. So it's about being able to imagine smelling something and being able to imagine what something feels like. That's also what part of what we call visualization, even though the word doesn't really sound like that's what we're talking about. And then the fourth one is projection, which is sending out energy. So not just being able to sense it in ourselves, but being able to send energy outward. So those are the 4 things: relaxation, concentration, visualization, and projection. And the next several exercises in the book aim to help teach those skills. So as you go through the exercises in the book, she provides a few examples of ways that you could go about starting to develop those skills. It is not an exhaustive list of ways that you could learn those skills, however. And then the last thing I wrote down in my personal notes about chapter 3 comes from the 20th anniversary notes on the chapter. It is a quote that I have loved since the first time I read the book years ago. And it is, "The more I open my eyes and ears, the more there is to see and hear." I love that because it gets at the fact that there's always more learning to do. We are always learning more. We're always growing and adapting and evolving. And certain things might stay the same over time if they are really sort of core aspects of our practice and who we are and what we believe, but other things will also change. And I feel like as much as I look back on things that I said or wrote down in my personal journals 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and cringe because I'm like, oh my goodness, I cannot believe I actually thought that at the time, or like, oh, I can't believe I didn't know this back then. I also look back at those things and I'm like, well, it's a good thing that I've learned and grown, because just imagine if I hadn't. And, you can forget the amount of progress that you've really made if you don't have something like that record to look back at, or someone to remind you, well, remember, 15 years ago you used to say this, and you might be tempted to think, no, I didn't. No, that doesn't sound like me. I would never. Because now I would never. But I look back at those journals, things from when I was 11 or 12 years old, and I just go, oh my goodness, I really did say that. And the notes to this book definitely include a lot of changes that Starhawk and that the reclaiming community had started to make in the first 10 years and 20 years after this book was originally published. That's a bit about what we talked about and discussed in the introductions to this book and chapters 1 through 3. And the next video that I do will be on the next few chapters. Maybe I'll do fewer chapters in the upcoming videos for this series. I'm not sure yet. We will see when we get there. And the things that I mentioned in this video are also not an exhaustive list of the things that I wrote down for myself in my personal little notebook here, and also not everything that we discussed and chatted about in the discussion group through my Patreon. So there's definitely more, and if there's something that I didn't mention here that stuck out to you, that's valid too, and you should come up with your own questions about it, do your journaling prompts about it, anything that sticks out to you. But I hope that for anyone reading through this book now who wanted maybe a little bit more structure as far as how to go through it or things to be paying attention to, I hope that this could help, or was just interesting to hear some of the things that I focused on and talked about and some of the things that we talked about in our group discussion. So when we read these chapters monthly, we read chapters 1 and 2 and the notes for them in the same month and discussed both of those chapters together in 1 month, because chapter 1 does not have any exercises in it. Chapter 2 begins to have a few exercises. And then we read chapter 3, the Coven, by itself the next month. So if you're looking for a way to break it up monthly without having to do 1 chapter per month, we combined chapters 1 and 2 in 1 month, and then chapter 3 as a separate thing. We then, next up, read chapter 4 as its own chapter for the next month, for the 3rd month. And then in the 4th month, which is this month, in August, we are currently reading chapters 5 and 6 together as well, because they are the chapters about the goddess and the god, so they kind of go together really well. So that's how we've broken it up so far, and I will be doing more videos as we go through after we are done discussing and I am done putting together some of my personal notes for the chapters. I will continue to make more of these videos, so you probably won't see another video in this series for a few months, couple of months, I don't know, but it's not going to be like week to week. It's going to be, each one of these will be coming a few months down the line, most likely. I won't keep you any further. Thank you so much for watching and or listening to this video. I will see you next time with something else, and until then, don't forget to be awesome, blessed be, and goodbye.